Hey everyone, today we're going to be making the Kenzie Skirt by Seamwork, and we're going to be modifying it to include a pocket as well as doing French seams along the pocket and the invisible zipper. So stay tuned and check it out. I had already made the Kenzie skirt once, so I knew I wanted to make it one size smaller, shorter, and add a pocket. To shorten, I simply cut along the lengthen or shorten line and overlap the pattern pieces by 3 3/4 inches. There is minimal truing that need to be done along the edges after shortening. To add a pocket, I printed out a generic pocket pattern, which I'll link below, and measured where the skirt would sit on my waist down to where I would comfortably use a pocket. I made a notch on the skirt piece and a matching notch on the pocket at 5/8 inch down because that was where my seam allowance would be. You can put your notch anywhere, but this gave me a good idea where my pocket opening would be. This is my screen printed fabric, which I made during my screen printing video series. The fabric is GOTS certified cotton sateen from Germany and was absolutely amazing to work with. The Kenzie skirt is pleated, which takes a lot of time to mark. I did 2 colored pins to denote the large or small circles, then went back and used tailor's chalk to mark an X or O to continue distinguishing the pleat marks. I don't think the waistband pattern is well drafted. Both times I made the skirt I had issues, so I will cover the changes I made. First, I used knit interfacing just to make sure the little bit of stretch in the fabric wasn't lost by using a woven interfacing. Second, the pieces are always too short, so I'd recommend using at least one size up on the waistband, as well as adding 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to the back waistband piece. Otherwise, the pattern only gives you a 1/4 inch to work with while top stitching. The pattern says to stay stitched, so I did, and it created waves in the pieces, which made me quite nervous. Thankfully, they ironed out. While researching how to sew French seams, I came across a blog discussing how, depending on the material, your finished seams could actually end up being larger than anticipated, making your garment slightly smaller. So I decided to test this on my fabric by marking my seam at 5/8 of an inch and seeing if the finished seam lined up with the mark. It's hard to see on camera, but I could still see some of the markings, so I knew my seam allowance wasn't going to be larger than expected. There's 2 main parts to seaming the pocket. One is sewing the seam around the pocket opening, and the second is sewing the perimeter of the pocket with the side seam of the skirt. First, we're going to sew the French seam around the pocket. I watched Sew Live's tutorial on this, which will be linked below. First, align the notches of one pocket piece to the skirt with wrong sides together. This is a little confusing, but will make sense later. My total seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, so I sewed the first seam at 1/4 inch along the pocket opening only. I'd recommend starting with a 5/8 inch total seam allowance to make sewing the French seams easier, especially for beginners like me. Next, Trim the pocket seam allowance by 1/8 of an inch to remove frayed edges. Only do this around the area you sewed. Now it's time to iron to make sewing the second part of the seam easier. First, iron the seam in one direction with the wrong side of the fabric up. Then, flip the pocket so right sides are now together and iron again. Since right sides are together, you can now sew the second set of stitches at 3/8 of an inch where you've already sewn. Press the seam allowance one last time towards the pocket. I noticed after the fact that a little bit of the raw edge was exposed, and I think this is because I should have sewn further down past the pocket since it has a curve. This means when the seam is finished, the pocket opening will be slightly bigger than when first attached to the skirt. Repeat this process with the other pocket and skirt piece. Sewing the seam along the side seam and pocket exterior is the same as we just did. First, place the two halves of the skirt on top of each other with wrong sides together. Sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance from top to bottom going around the pocket. Trim 1/8 of an inch off the entire seam and clip the corner edges where the pocket meets the skirt. Now press a seam allowance to one side. I don't have a ham, so I couldn't press the pocket seam allowance, and it still turned out great. Then, place the right sides together and press again, making sure the pocket openings are lined up. I pinned mine in place to make sure they stayed. Now, sew a 3/8 inch seam allowance around the area you just sewed. Because of how the pocket is attached with a French seam, the line leading up to the pocket isn't perfectly straight. To fix this, you can go back and extend the final seam line so it continues in a straight line above and below the pocket opening. Now that the first big hurdle was over, I could get back to assembling the skirt. As I mentioned previously, the waistband really gave me trouble. I only sewed a 1/4 inch seam where the front and back pieces met up, and it was still almost too small. I'd recommend going up a size or two. I also don't like how the directions want you to baste 2 lines to secure the pleats, then sew the waistband between them. For a beginner, that's a lot to ask, and if you accidentally sew over the bottom basting line, removing those stitches becomes a pain. So instead, I just attach the waistband below both basting lines about 5/8 of an inch down. Okay, so the last intimidating part is here, attaching the invisible zipper. They aren't as bad as they sound, and from what I could find, to do a French seam with an invisible zipper, you start by attaching the zipper as normal. Decide where you want the zipper, making sure not to place the end too close to the top because you want to leave room for the clasp. Clip the bottom of the zipper in place and then flip one side of the teeth out on top of the right side of the fabric. I don't have an invisible zipper foot, although I should probably buy one. So I just use a regular zipper foot. Place it on your machine so the indented part will go under the teeth and the needle will sew on top of the zipper tape. Sew top to bottom. Repeat this for the other side of the zipper and make sure it zips. I had a lot of extra material at the seam, so I needed to mark and cut the excess fabric so I'd have a 5/8 inch seam allowance. From what I read about adding a French seam, you'll need to cut into the seam allowance below the zipper, but above where the zipper tape ends. Do not cut more than 1/4 inch into the seam, otherwise it may show through. Now turn the seam so it's on the outside of the skirt and the zipper is sitting behind the fabric. Pin and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance like done previously. Iron the seam to one side on the right side of the fabric, then flip the seam to the inside of the skirt and iron again. Sew a seam at 3/8 inch from the bottom up to the zipper. You will now have to hand sew the rest of the gap between the zipper and the side seam like normal. I also sewed the top edge of the seam to the bottom of the zipper tape. I was unsure how to finish the fabric along the sides of the zipper, so I simply folded the fabric underneath and used a zigzag stitch to secure the fabric and prevent fraying. The pattern wants you to sew the hem in the beginning, but I waited until the very end so I could try on the skirt and ended up taking off an additional 3 inches. This project seems super intimidating, but once I broke everything down into steps, it wasn't bad at all, and I'm so happy with the results. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot about French seams. I know I did, and I will definitely be using them again. I love the finish. It's so clean on the inside and it just makes the garment feel much higher quality than if I were just to zigzag stitch the ends. So if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe or ring the bell to be notified when my next video is released.